The dying sheriff grabbed the cowboy's coat and whispered one final request. But the woman waiting in Black Creek had no idea another man was coming for her. Red dust slammed against the train station windows as Ruby Mae Carter stood frozen beside her suitcase. Across the platform, a cowboy she'd never seen before tightened his grip around a worn silver ring while the whistle screamed through the desert. Then he stepped closer and quietly said, "Jonah Pike asked me to marry you before he died." Ruby didn't cry. She only looked him dead in the eyes and answered, "I won't marry a man who feels sorry for me." What happened after that changed the fate of the entire town. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. The storm rolled across the New Mexico territory like the end of the world. Red dust slammed against the freight wagons hard enough to shake the iron lanterns hanging beneath them. Mules screamed somewhere ahead in the dark haze. The wind carried grit so thick it scraped against skin like sandpaper. Silas Reed pulled his bandana higher over his mouth and pushed through the storm toward the overturned wagon near the tracks. "Jonah," he shouted. No answer, just wind. The silver shipment lay scattered across the rocky ground. One crate had burst open beside the rail line, silver bars half buried beneath drifting sand. A dead horse twisted in its harness nearby, its saddle creaking whenever the wind hit. Silas spotted blood first, dark against the dirt. Then he saw Jonah Pike slumped against the wheel. The deputy sheriff's coat was soaked through near the ribs. His hat was gone. Dust clung to the sweat on his face, turning him almost the same color as the canyon walls around them. Silas dropped beside him immediately. "Easy," he muttered. "Easy now." Jonah coughed once. Blood touched the corner of his mouth. "Rail gang came out of nowhere," he rasped. "Thought we could outrun 'em." Silas looked toward the tracks disappearing into the storm. No sign of the outlaws now. Just endless blowing sand and the low whistle of a distant train somewhere beyond the hills. "You're gonna make it," Silas said automatically. Jonah gave him a tired look. "No," he whispered. "I ain't." The wind rattled the broken wagon. For a second, neither man spoke. They'd known each other almost 15 years, since Texas. Since army camps and cattle drives and winters cold enough to split skin open. Jonah had once pulled Silas out of a river during the war, after a horse rolled on him in freezing water. Nobody had ever done that for Silas before. Nobody except Jonah. Jonah's trembling hand disappeared inside his coat and came back holding a small ring wrapped in cloth. "Need you to do something," he said. Silas already hated the sound of it. "Don't promise me." Silas stared at the ring in Jonah's bloody hand. "Her name's Ruby Mae Carter," Jonah whispered. "Black Creek, school teacher." Silas frowned. "You never said nothin' about a woman." Jonah managed the faintest smile. "She was smarter than me. Figured I'd scare her off if I talked too much." Another cough bent him forward. Silas caught his shoulder. "Easy." Jonah sucked in a painful breath. "I was gonna marry her come winter." The storm screamed across the canyon. Silas looked down at the ring again. Old silver, worn smooth with age. "She got nobody out there," Jonah continued. "Town's turnin' on her. Mine owner wants her gone." "You're talking nonsense. I need you to listen." Jonah grabbed Silas by the coat with surprising strength. "If I die, you go to Black Creek." Silas already knew where this was heading. "No, you marry her." The words vanished into the wind between them. Silas stared at him like he'd gone insane. "You got hit too hard in the head. I'm serious. You want me to marry a woman I ain't never met? I want somebody decent beside her when they come for that school." Silas looked away toward the tracks. Marriage, home, responsibility. He'd spent most of his life avoiding exactly those things. "You don't owe me that," he muttered. Jonah laughed weakly. "You remember Colorado?" Silas did. Snow waist deep. Army scouts pinned near the ridge. Silas bleeding out beside a frozen creek while everyone else kept riding. Everyone except Jonah. "You already know I owe you," Silas said quietly. Jonah's grip weakened. "She ain't fragile," he whispered. "Don't treat her that way." The wind eased for one brief second, long enough for Silas to hear the train whistle again far off across the desert. Then Jonah pressed the ring into his palm. "Promise me." Silas closed his rough hand around the cold silver. Every instinct inside him screamed not to do it. But Jonah was looking at him the same way he had all those years ago beside the Frupton River, trusting him completely. "All right," Silas said finally. "I promise." Jonah's shoulders loosened. The storm kept moving west. An hour later, Jonah Pike died beside the railroad tracks with red dust gathering across his boots. Silas buried him the next morning beneath a crooked mesquite tree overlooking the canyon. No preacher, no church bell, just wind and dirt and silence. By the time he reached Black Creek 3 days later, the storm had followed him. Dust rolled through the mining town in angry waves. Wooden signs creaked overhead. Men in soot-covered work clothes drifted between the saloon and the assay office while the train station groaned beneath the wind. Silas stepped off his horse slowly, stiff from the ride. Then he saw her. Ruby Mae Carter stood near the station platform, holding a worn leather suitcase against her skirt. Dark coat buttoned to the throat. Hair pinned neatly despite the storm clawing at everything around her. And those eyes, sharp, steady, not soft at all. She looked at Silas first, then at the black ribbon tied around Jonah's deputy badge hanging from his saddle. Something in her face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. Silas removed his hat slowly. "Miss Carter?" Her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. "Yes." Dust struck the station windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Silas swallowed once. "Jonah's dead." The words landed between them heavy as stone. Ruby didn't cry, didn't gasp, didn't move. The only sign she'd heard him at all was the way her knuckles turned pale around the leather strap. Behind them, a train whistle cut across the desert. Long, lonely. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out the ring wrapped in cloth. "He asked me to bring this." Ruby stared at it for several seconds before taking it carefully. Then Silas forced himself to say the rest. "He also asked me to marry you in his place." That finally broke the stillness. Ruby looked up slowly. The storm wind whipped loose strands of hair across her face. "What?" Silas shifted uncomfortably. "He said he wanted somebody beside you," said the town. "I heard what you said." Her voice stayed calm, too calm. Silas suddenly understood why Jonah warned him about her not being fragile. People probably mistook quiet for weakness, all the time. They were wrong. Ruby looked down at the ring again, then back at him. "I won't marry a man who pities me." The station fell silent except for the wind. Silas felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. "It ain't pity." "Then what is it?" "A promise." Ruby gave a bitter little laugh. "Funny thing about promises," she said quietly. "Men usually make them right before they leave." Silas didn't answer. A pair of miners stepped past them, carrying crates, both openly staring before disappearing toward the freight office. Ruby noticed it too. She noticed everything. Finally, she looked back toward the dusty main street. "They're shutting my school down next month," she said. Silas frowned. "Mine owner says children, working the sorting tables matter more than learning letters." Her mouth tightened slightly. "And apparently a colored woman teaching white and Mexican children together makes decent people nervous." The wind pushed sand across the station floorboards. "Jonah knew," she continued. "That's why he was coming back before winter." Silas stared at her for a long moment. This wasn't some lonely woman waiting for rescue. This was somebody standing alone against an entire town. And somehow Jonah believed Silas Reed was the answer to that problem. God help them both. Ruby tucked the ring into her coat pocket. "You should know something, Mr. Reed." "What's that?" "If I agree to this arrangement," her eyes met his directly, "it'll be because I need somewhere to survive. Not because I belong to anybody." Silas looked at the red dust blowing through Black Creek, then back at the woman standing in front of him. "Fair enough," he said quietly. For the first time since arriving, Ruby looked slightly surprised, but only slightly. The train whistle sounded again somewhere out in the desert, and above them the storm kept rolling west. Ruby led Silas down the main street of Black Creek without another word. Dust curled around their boots in little red spirals. Most of the storefronts had already shut their shutters against the weather. Lamps glowed behind dirty glass windows, while piano music drifted faintly from the saloon across the street. People stared as they passed. Silas noticed that right away. Not loud staring. Frontier towns were too careful for that, but the kind that lingered half a second too long before turning away. Ruby noticed too. She kept her chin up anyway. Her school sat at the edge of town beside an abandoned barber shop. A narrow wooden building with faded blue paint and two cracked front windows patched with newspaper from Santa Fe. Ruby unlocked the door and stepped inside first. The room smelled like chalk dust and old pine boards. Small desks filled the space, some repaired so many times the legs no longer matched. A black iron stove sat cold in the corner. On the back wall hung a hand-painted alphabet banner with missing letters carefully stitched back in place. Silas removed his hat slowly. "You teach all these kids here?" Ruby set her suitcase beside the desk. Did. His eyes shifted toward her. "The council voted yesterday," she said quietly, while lighting a kerosene lamp. "Harland Crow owns half the town, including the council members. Says children are more useful carrying ore than learning grammar." The flame flickered gold across her face. Silas finally understood why Jonah sounded worried before he died. Ruby wasn't losing a job. She was losing the only thing keeping her anchored in Black Creek. She moved toward a stack of papers tied with twine. Enrollment records, supply receipts, lesson plans. Her fingers brushed the bundle once. Funny how a whole life can fit inside one crate. Silas leaned against the doorway. "You got family anywhere?" "No." "You got someplace else to go?" Ruby gave him a look over her shoulder. "If I had, do you think I'd still be standing here?" The wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Silas looked around again. Tiny desks, slates stacked neatly. 3 chipped coffee mugs drying beside a basin. Whoever Ruby Mae Carter was, she'd built this place carefully, probably alone. "You really mean to marry a stranger?" she asked suddenly. Silas shrugged once. "Made a promise. That isn't an answer." "No," he admitted, "it ain't." Ruby studied him quietly for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and sat at one of the student desks like she suddenly didn't have the strength to stand anymore. "He wrote me every Sunday," she said softly. "Did Jonah?" Silas stayed quiet. "He never talked big, never tried impressing me." A faint smile touched her mouth and disappeared again. "Mostly wrote about weather, horses, complained about railroad coffee." "Sounds like Jonah. He told me you hated card games because you always lost." Silas snorted. "That part's true." The silence afterward felt different. Not softer exactly, but less sharp. Ruby opened one of the drawers in the desk and pulled out a folded document. "Town notice," she said, handing it over. Silas unfolded the paper beneath the lamplight. "Property to be vacated before first snowfall. Signed by the Black Creek Council." Harland Crow's name sat at the bottom in thick black ink. "You got 3 weeks," Silas muttered. Ruby folded her arms tightly. "Less than that if Crow gets impatient." Silas stared at the paper another second before handing it back. "Come with me." Ruby blinked once. "Just like that? Ain't much reason staying here now." "And where exactly would I be going?" "Cedar Pass. Small ranch north of the canyon." "You own it?" "No. Work it." He paused. "Comes with a foreman's house." Ruby looked toward the dark windows where red dust still scraped against the glass, then back at him. "You should know something before you ask me again," she said carefully. "I don't cook because I'm expected to. I don't obey men because they raise their voice. And I won't spend my life pretending to be grateful for basic decency." Silas listened without interrupting. Finally, he nodded once. "Fine by me." That seemed to throw her more than any argument would have. "You don't care?" "About what?" "All of it." Silas adjusted his hat. "Miss Carter, I spend most my days hauling feed, fixing fences, and trying not to get kicked in the head by bad-tempered horses. Long as you don't burn the house down, I reckon we'll get along." For the first time since meeting her, he saw it. The smallest twitch at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile exactly, but close enough to count. They married 3 days later. The storm had passed by then, leaving the town washed in pale autumn sunlight and cold desert wind. The church sat near the cemetery at the far end of Black Creek. Crooked white boards, bell tower leaning slightly east, one stained glass window cracked straight through the middle. Elena Morales stood beside Ruby wearing a dark shawl and holding a small bouquet of dried desert flowers tied with string. The old preacher coughed through half the ceremony. Silas kept his eyes mostly on the floorboards. Ruby stood straight beside him in a simple navy dress with pearl buttons at the cuffs. No veil, no gloves. When the preacher reached the part about kissing the bride, an awkward silence filled the church. Silas glanced at Ruby. Ruby glanced back. Then both of them quietly looked at the preacher instead. The old man cleared his throat. "Well," he muttered, "I suppose a handshake works too." Elena laughed out loud before she could stop herself. Silas and Ruby shook hands beneath the church windows while dust drifted through the sunlight. It was the strangest wedding Black Creek had probably ever seen. By sunset, they were already heading north toward Cedar Pass. Ruby sat beside Silas in the wagon seat, holding one small suitcase on her lap, while the canyon shadows stretched long across the trail. Neither of them spoke much. Somewhere behind them, Black Creek disappeared into dust and distance. Ahead waited a ranch neither of them truly wanted. And somehow, despite everything, neither turned back. The ride to Cedar Pass took nearly 4 hours. By the time they crossed the narrow canyon trail, the sun had fallen low behind the red cliffs. Long shadows stretched across the desert floor. The wagon wheels rattled over loose stone, while cold wind drifted down from the higher ridges. Ruby sat quietly beside Silas with Jonah's ring hidden inside her coat pocket. She hadn't put it on. Silas noticed that. He didn't mention it. The ranch appeared slowly out of the dusk. A weather-beaten house crouched beside a crooked corral fence. One side of the barn leaned slightly where old storm damage had never been repaired. A rusted water pump stood near the porch, with a tin bucket hanging from it by frayed rope. Ruby stared at the place for several seconds. "This is it." Silas climbed down from the wagon. "Told you it wasn't fancy. That's one word for it." A loose shutter slammed somewhere against the house as wind pushed through the canyon. Silas unloaded her suitcase first. The porch creaked beneath their boots when they stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of cedar smoke, leather, and coffee grounds left too long in a tin pot. One oil lamp burned near the kitchen sink. The rest of the room sat in shadow. Ruby took everything in carefully. 2 bedrooms, a small cast-iron stove, worn blankets folded neatly over a chair, a row of horseshoes nailed above the door. No pictures on the walls, no signs another person had ever truly lived there. "You always keep it this quiet?" she asked. Silas set her suitcase beside the hallway. "Usually just me and the horses." Ruby moved toward the kitchen table. A stack of ranch receipts sat beside an open ledger book. Dates, feed costs, rail invoices from Albuquerque. Messy handwriting covered half the pages. "You do your own bookkeeping?" she asked. Enough to survive." She flipped one page carefully. "You overpaid for oats." Silas blinked once. "What? This supplier charged you twice for the same delivery." Ruby pointed toward a number near the bottom. "Right here." Silas stepped closer. Sure enough, she was right. He rubbed the back of his neck slowly. "Never noticed." "I can tell." Silence settled again. Not uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar. Ruby removed her gloves, finger by finger, and placed them carefully on the table. Her hands were slender, but roughened near the fingertips from chalk and sewing needles. "You can take the bedroom at the end of the hall," Silas said. "Window sticks sometimes. Gotta shove it hard. And you? Other room." Ruby nodded once. No hesitation, no teasing implication. That almost relieved him. Almost. Later that night, they ate cold beans and skillet bread beside the stove, while wind whistled through cracks in the walls. Ruby drank coffee black. Silas noticed that too. "You always look at people that hard?" she asked suddenly, without lifting her eyes from her cup. Silas nearly choked on his coffee. I ain't looking hard. You notice everything, he shrugged. Occupational habit. What occupation is that exactly? Cowboy? Freight hauler? Reluctant husband? That caught him off guard enough to pull the smallest smile from him. Ruby noticed. Interesting, her face seemed to say. Outside, coyotes cried somewhere far across the canyon. The sound carried through the dark like ghosts. After supper, Ruby insisted on washing the dishes herself, despite Silas telling her to leave them until morning. You don't have to prove anything, he said from the doorway. I know. Then why are you scrubbing that pan like it insulted your family? Ruby kept working another second before answering. Because if I stop moving, she said quietly, I might think too much. Silas leaned against the frame without replying. He understood that better than he wanted to. The next morning arrived cold and pale. Sunlight spilled gold across the canyon walls, while frost clung to the fence posts outside. Ruby woke to the sound of hammering. She stepped onto the porch wearing a wool sweater over her nightdress and found Silas rebuilding the chicken coop gate with a mouthful of nails. He glanced up once. You should wear boots out here. Scorpions like the woodpile. Ruby immediately stepped backward. Silas looked away fast enough to hide the grin threatening his face. By noon, she had unpacked half her belongings into the spare bedroom. Books mostly. More books than Silas had seen in one place his entire life. History, readers, arithmetic primers, poetry collections worn soft from use. Ruby lined them carefully along the shelf beside the window. There weren't enough shelves. Silas noticed her glance toward the growing stack on the floor. That afternoon, he disappeared into the barn. Around sunset, Ruby heard sawing outside. She stepped onto the porch again. Silas stood near the stable wall covered in sawdust, building a rough wooden bookshelf from spare fence boards. You making furniture now? She asked. Looks more like surviving your book problem. Ruby crossed her arms against the evening cold. You don't have to do that. I know. The answer landed softer than she expected. Silas kept hammering while twilight settled over Cedar Pass. His hands moved steady and sure beneath the fading light. Ruby watched quietly from the porch. A strange feeling touched her chest then. Not safety exactly. Something quieter. Something dangerous because of how badly she wanted to trust it. 3 days later, she turned the empty storage shed beside the barn into a classroom, again. Tiny desks made from feed crates, a slate board nailed against the wall, books stacked neatly beside the lantern. Word traveled faster than either of them expected. By the following Monday, 6 children arrived. 2 Mexican boys from the Morales Ranch, a freckled girl whose father worked cattle south of the canyon. 3 children from nearby labor camps. Ruby taught grammar while wind rattled the shed walls. Silas pretended not to listen while repairing tack outside, but he heard her voice through the open doorway. Calm, patient, steady. The children listened to her like sunlight itself might disappear if they missed a word. Near afternoon, a horse approached fast across the dirt road. Buck Tanner, drunk already. Silas recognized the sway before the man even dismounted. Buck stumbled toward the classroom with whiskey breath and dusty boots. What's all this then? He barked loudly. The children froze. Ruby remained standing beside the slate board. Class is in session, she said evenly. Buck laughed. Teaching ranch brats their ABCs now? No answer. Then Buck's eyes slid toward Ruby herself. You really think folks around here want? Silas straightened slowly outside. But before he could move, Ruby picked up the wooden ruler from her desk and pointed calmly toward the open door. Leave before I make these children watch a grown man embarrass himself. Silence hit the room. Even the wind seemed to pause. Buck blinked hard, probably because nobody talked to him that way. Especially not calmly. Ruby didn't raise her voice once. Didn't step back either. Buck muttered something under his breath and finally staggered outside again. He stopped short when he realized Silas had been standing there the whole time. The 2 men locked eyes. Buck spat in the dirt, then mounted his horse and rode off without another word. Inside the classroom, the children slowly relaxed. Ruby simply returned to the blackboard, like nothing had happened. But Silas stayed outside a long moment longer, watching her through the open doorway. For the first time since Jonah died, she no longer looked like a promise he was forced to carry. She looked like someone fighting beside him, and somehow that felt far more dangerous. Winter settled over Black Creek early that year. By mid-November, frost covered the wagon tracks every morning, and thin sheets of ice formed along the cattle trough outside the barn. Wind rolled through Cedar Pass, hard enough to rattle the window panes before sunrise. Still, every Monday and Thursday, children arrived at the little school beside the stable. Some came wrapped in patched blankets. Some carried slates under their arms tied with twine. One boy rode 6 miles alone on a mule too old for mountain roads. Ruby greeted every one of them by name. Silas noticed that too. She remembered things people thought the world had forgotten. Who needed boots, who squinted when reading, whose mother was sick, whose father drank too much after payday at the mines. The ranch slowly changed around her, not loudly, quietly, like snow gathering on fence rails overnight. One evening, Silas returned from town with a sack of coffee beans, lamp oil, and 2 ledgers tucked beneath his arm. Ruby looked up from correcting arithmetic papers. "What are those?" "Account books." "You bought account books voluntarily." Silas hung his coat beside the stove. "Don't sound so shocked. You once calculated feed costs on the back of a tobacco flyer. That system worked. It nearly bankrupted you." A small smile touched the corner of his mouth before he sat beside her at the kitchen table. The oil lamp burned low between them. Ruby opened the first ledger and dipped her pen carefully into ink. For the next hour, she reorganized freight costs while Silas watched in silence. Outside, cold winds swept across the canyon. Inside, only the scratching of her pen filled the room. "You ever think about expanding?" she asked eventually. Silas leaned back in his chair. "Ranch barely survives winter now. I'm not talking cattle." She turned the ledger toward him. "If you use the wagon routes to carry supplies too, you'd make steadier money." "Supplies for who?" "Families. Mining camps, rail workers." Ruby tapped the page softly. "Medicine, flour, sewing cloth, coffee." Silas studied the numbers. She'd already done the calculations. Precise, clean, practical. "You figured all this out tonight?" Ruby shrugged lightly. "Couldn't sleep." He looked at her for a long moment. "You missed your calling." "No," she said quietly. "I found it. People just kept trying to take it away." That stayed with him longer than he expected. A week later, they made their first delivery run together. The wagon carried flour sacks, canned peaches, lamp oil, and 2 wooden crates of medicine bound for camps north of Black Creek. Snow clouds hung low over the canyon while Silas tightened the harness straps. Ruby climbed into the wagon seat, wearing a dark wool coat Elena Morales had altered for her. "You know this road gets rough after Miller's Ridge?" Silas asked. "I know. And if the wagon tips, I know." "You always this stubborn?" Ruby adjusted her gloves. "Only around stubborn men." Silas climbed up beside her, shaking his head, but he was smiling again. That happened more lately. They reached the mining camps near dusk. Children chased beside the wagon, while workers lined up quietly near the supply crates. One old miner removed his hat when Ruby handed him medicine for his coughing wife. Another man asked if she still taught reading lessons. Word about her had spread farther than Black Creek now. Silas saw the way people looked at her. Not with pity, with trust. That evening, while unloading crates outside the boarding house, a polished black carriage rolled slowly through town. Harland Crow stepped out wearing a dark wool coat trimmed with silver buttons, owner of Black Creek Silver Company, the richest man for 50 miles, and the kind of man who noticed everything he considered a threat. His eyes settled on Ruby immediately, then on the supply wagon, then on Silas. Crow approached with slow confidence. "Mr. Reed," he said smoothly, "didn't know you'd entered the freight business. Didn't know I needed permission." Crow smiled without warmth. His gaze shifted toward Ruby. "Miss Carter, or should I say Mrs. Reed now?" Ruby stood straight beside the wagon wheel. Most people simply say good evening. Something flickered briefly behind Crow's eyes. Not anger, calculation. I hear your little classrooms become popular, he said. The children seem to think education matters. Dangerous idea around a mining town. Silas felt the air tighten beside him. Crow rested one gloved hand on the wagon rail. You know, he said casually, workers who learn too much start asking expensive questions. Ruby met his gaze evenly. Maybe that says more about the contracts than the workers. For 1 second, the entire street seemed to go still. Even the horses shifted uneasily. Crow looked at her a long time after that. Then he smiled again, thin as a knife blade. Well, he said softly, winter has a way of correcting ambitious plans around here. He tipped his hat once and returned to his carriage. Silas watched the black wheels disappear into the snow-covered street. That man gives me a bad feeling, Ruby said quietly. He gives everybody a bad feeling, but people still obey him. Silas looked toward the distant mine smoke rising against the gray sky. Out here, he said, men with money usually get mistaken for men with power. Ruby didn't answer. Later that night, they returned home beneath a sky crowded with cold stars. The ranch sat dark except for the lantern hanging beside the porch. Silas unloaded the last crate while Ruby gathered blankets from the wagon seat. Then she suddenly stopped moving. What is it? Silas asked. Ruby pointed toward the stable. A horse stood inside the corral, trembling violently. Its front leg bent wrong beneath its weight. Fresh rope burns marked its neck. Silas moved closer carefully. The animal flinched hard at human voices. Probably dumped by prospectors, he muttered. Can you save it? Silas studied the broken leg in silence. Most ranchers would have reached for a rifle already. Ruby knelt slowly beside the frightened horse, despite the freezing dirt soaking through her skirt. Her hand hovered near its face without touching. It's scared, she whispered. Silas looked at her then. Not the horse, her. The wind moved strands of dark hair loose around her cheeks while lantern light flickered gold across her skin. The horse slowly lowered its head toward her hand, trusting her anyway. Silas exhaled quietly. We'll try, he said. Ruby looked up at him, not smiling, but softer somehow. And for the first time since Jonah's death, the ranch no longer felt like two strangers hiding from silence. It felt like something alive, beginning to breathe. The wounded horse survived the winter, barely. Silas built a narrow support brace from scrap pine and old leather straps, while Ruby sat beside the animal each evening with a lantern and a bucket of warm mash. Some nights the horse shook from pain so hard the stall rattled. Still, it kept standing. Ruby understood that kind of stubbornness. By December, snow covered most of Cedar Pass. The roads into Black Creek narrowed to muddy wagon ruts lined with ice, and every trip to town became a gamble against weather. Silas started leaving before dawn now, hauling freight between settlements, while Ruby kept the school running beside the stable. The children arrived wrapped in scarves and oversized coats, smelling faintly of coal smoke and cedar wood. Some mornings, Ruby found tiny frozen footprints already waiting outside before sunrise. One afternoon, she was writing multiplication problems across the chalkboard when the classroom door burst open hard enough to shake the hinges. Buck Tanner staggered inside drunk. Whiskey hit the room before his voice did. The children immediately went silent. Buck pointed toward Ruby with an uneven grin. Well now, he slurred. Looks like Black Creek's become a real fancy place. Got ourselves a schoolteacher queen out in the dirt. Ruby slowly set the chalk down. Mr. Tanner, she said evenly, you're frightening the children. They ought to learn the world ain't kind. He kicked at one of the desks. A little girl near the stove flinched hard. Buck laughed at that. Ruby stepped between him and the children without hesitation. You need leave? Buck's smile faded. Or what? The room held still. Only the wind outside moved. Ruby picked up the long wooden ruler from her desk and pointed calmly toward the open doorway. Leave before I make these children watch a grown man embarrass himself. Buck stared at her, not expecting resistance. Certainly not from someone standing alone in a freezing schoolhouse. You think marrying Reed made you important? He snapped. No, Ruby said quietly. Teaching these children to read did that. For one ugly second, Silas thought Buck might lunge forward, because Silas was already standing outside the doorway, hand resting near his holster. He'd heard every word. Buck noticed him then. The drunken anger in his face shifted fast into caution. Silas didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence between men out west could carry more danger than shouting ever did. Buck spit into the dirt floor and backed toward the door. This town's changing too much, he muttered before stumbling outside into the snow. The children stayed quiet, long after he disappeared. Ruby slowly lowered the ruler. Her hand trembled once. Only once. Then she turned calmly back toward the class. Now, she said softly, where were we? A small boy near the stove raised his hand carefully. 6 times 7? Ruby smiled faintly. That's right. Outside, Silas remained standing beside the stable wall for a long moment. Snow drifted across his boots. He'd spent months telling himself this marriage was obligation, duty, a promise to Jonah. But watching Ruby stand there alone between danger and those children had unsettled something deep inside him. Because she didn't look like someone needing rescue anymore. She looked like someone fighting beside him. And somehow that felt far more dangerous. That night the wind screamed through Cedar Pass hard enough to shake the roof beams. Ruby sat at the kitchen table repairing a torn coat sleeve while Silas sharpened a ranch knife near the stove. Neither spoke much. The oil lamp burned low between them. Finally, Silas said quietly, "You should told me Buck was bothering you before." Ruby kept sewing. "I handled it. I know you did. Then what's the problem?" Silas leaned back slowly in his chair. "The problem's men like Buck don't scare easy once whiskey gets involved." Ruby tied off the stitch carefully before looking up. "You think I scare easy?" "No." The answer came too fast, too honest. Their eyes held a second longer than usual. Then Ruby looked back down at the coat in her lap. "I spent years learning how to survive men like him," she said softly. "I'm tired of acting afraid just to make cruel people comfortable." The fire cracked sharply beside them. Silas watched her hands move beneath the lamplight, steady again now. "You know what the strange thing is," he said, after a while. "What?" "You don't act like somebody the world pushed around." Ruby gave a small, tired laugh. "That's because the world already tried." Silas didn't answer immediately. Then he stood, crossed the room quietly, and placed another piece of wood into the stove before the fire died down. A simple thing. But Ruby noticed he'd chosen the dry cedar pieces instead of pine. Cedar burned slower, warmer. He was thinking ahead for her again. He did that often now, without realizing it. Later that night, Ruby fell asleep at the table beside the unfinished coat. The lamp still flickered softly beside her cheek. Silas stepped out of his room sometime after midnight for coffee and found her there. For a moment, he simply stood watching. The loose strands of hair near her face, the ink smudge on her wrist, the exhaustion she carried like something permanent. Carefully, he lifted the folded wool blanket from the chair nearby and placed it over her shoulders. Ruby stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Silas hesitated. Then, his hand rested lightly against her shoulder just long enough to make sure she was warm. Nothing more. But he didn't move away immediately either. Outside, snow drifted across the dark canyon in silence. Inside, the ranch breathed softly around them. And somewhere beneath the cold and loneliness and promises made to distant men, something dangerous had already begun growing between them. Maybe that's what love really looks like out on the frontier. Not grand speeches, not perfect timing, just 2 tired people standing in a cold kitchen long after midnight, quietly choosing each other again and again. If you've ever carried grief so long it became part of your bones, if you've ever convinced yourself survival was enough, then maybe you understand Silas and Ruby better than they understood themselves back then. Because sometimes healing doesn't arrive like a miracle. Sometimes it shows up wearing dust-covered boots. Sometimes it brings coffee before sunrise. Sometimes it places a blanket over your shoulders without waking you up. And little by little, the loneliness starts losing ground. Jonah's promise may have brought them together, but loyalty alone could never have built a life like this. What saved them was trust, patience, the quiet courage to let another person see the parts of themselves they'd hidden from the world for years. That kind of love changes a person slowly, almost gently. Before you go, tell me this in the comments. Do you think real love begins with passion, or with feeling safe beside someone? And if stories like this still mean something to you, stories about wounded people finding warmth in hard places, then stay a while longer with this channel. There are still more dusty roads, lonely towns, and unforgettable souls waiting just beyond the next canyon.